thank you everyone for joining us. It's really great to have you here. Today we have a really exciting talk by our BIP Science Coordinator, Nathalie Steinhauer, on the topic of colony autopsies. So I will let Nathalie take it from here.
Okay, thank you, Rachel. Let me share my screen. All right, we decided to have a little bit of a spooky episode today in honor of Halloween coming up this month. Picking a little bit of a, spooky topic on honeybee colony autopsies. And yeah, there is already a little bit of a spoiler on this first graph that we're going to come back to in a bit. So of course, it's never fun to go to your operation, to your apiary and find one or several colonies that have collapsed and so finding a couple of dead outs. And we are often asked, by beekeepers who want to send us, maybe pictures or ask us information about how can we tell what happened in our colonies. And so obviously, I'm going to have a disclaimer at first. It is that it's extremely hard posteriori to know what happened in a colony. We can make guesses. We can make, our best educated guess, but it's going to be very hard to know for sure. But there are things that with experience you can learn to pick up that can indicate one cause being more likely than another. So the objective of this talk is going to be to go over some of those, like what should you go through and what should you look for if you encounter a dead out in your operation, and then what lessons can we take from those. Obviously, the objective is not to blame ourselves too much, but it's in order to improve as beekeepers. We have to learn from our past mistake. Ideally, you would learn from other people's past mistakes from this talk. And then the idea too is, sometimes when you have a dead out, it's really hard to know, well, can you reuse the equipment? Should you reuse some of the honey frames in it? What can you do with it? So that is going to be depending on the case. And so we're going to cover some of that as well today. So whenever you encounter a dead out in your operation, this is kind of like the list of the steps that an investigator on honeybee colony health should go through. So we're going to go over what was the time of the event, and then examining the outside of the colony for any clues already coming in to the yard. And then we're going to go inside the colony, examine the bottom board, and then actually opening the colony to examine the inner cover, top frames, and then the cluster itself. And finally, we also are going to have to ask questions about, the past about this colony. What do you know about what happened in the last few months over it? Okay, so we start by asking what time of year did the collapse happen? What time of year did the colony die? Or at least when did you notice that the colony was dead? Obviously, a lot of us are skipping, the winter period. We don't go as often as for the rest of the season. So you might have missed a colony maybe late in the fall that already has been died, and only notice it in the spring. So part of the investigation is going to be to try to determine when did the colony actually die. All right, so that we're going to go over that throughout the presentation. There is, as I said, not a single answer for that, but this is something that is going to bring some, some information, some background information on what would the likely cause be. Now, of course, depending on the season, you also are going to have things that are going to be more likely than others. So, for example, a pesticide spray is going to be more likely to happen in the active season than in the winter. And there are some things that are also normal depending on the time of year, right? We all know that in the fall, you're going to find a pack of dead drones in front of your colony. That is, part of the annual normal cycle of the colonies. That's not unusual. So that's why the time of year is going to really inform you as to what is most likely to happen. All right. So when first you encounter a colony that has died, the first thing to do is just to look at the outside of the colony. So we're going to look at the front of the colony, at the entrance itself, but also the front on the ground in front of the colony. And we're going to look to see, well, is there a lot of bees or only a little number of bees? Are there no bees at all? Can you find absolutely no dead bees or very, very little dead bees in front or at the of your colony? Are there mummies present? So all of those things are things that you can observe. So one thing to know is that a small number of dead bees at the entrance of your colony, definitely, in the winter, in the spring, is actually normal. And so if the bees are actually dead at the entrance, it might actually even be a good sign, because that means that there has been some undertaker worker bee that brought those bees outside and dropped them in the front, or at the entrance or down in front of the colony. So that means that the undertaker actually did their job. It means that there is still some undertaker active at that point. So depending on the time of year, and a small number of dead bees at the entrance of the colony is not unusual, and it's not a bad sign per se. Now, if you have obviously like here, a big amount of dead bees, that is obviously more concerning, and we're going to have to investigate further. One thing I wanted to point out too is those mummies in the front of the colony. This is actually due to shock brood. And I'm going to have a slide on shock brood on its own, because sometimes beekeepers are concerned about this. It's really impressive when you have it, but it's actually not that. It can be, most of the time bees will actually handle shock brood on their own. So I wanted to show that because, okay. So shock brood, you can identify it in the hive. Before the hive, shock brood in itself is rarely going to kill a colony. This is typically a fungal infection that happens more prevalently in the spring. It's usually associated with high humidity, low pollen flow, sometimes also pre-existing stressors, like some lineages of queens are more susceptible to shock brood than others. And so typically when you have a lot of shock brood issue, one of the recommendations is that you might consider changing your line of bees to get more resistance into your lines. But so those mummies at the front of the colony is actually the larvae that has been infected by the fungus, and therefore bees are going to come and they're going to clear it out, and they're going to drop it in front of the colony and at the bottom board. So you might find them both dropping at the bottom board of the colony or in front of the colony. Those are larvae that have not been cleared out yet, and typically we usually say that the way that you recognize shock brood is like it looks a little bit like a brie cheese, and when you have that bee coloration that looks like brie, this is very typical of shock brood. So as we said, most of the time shock brood is not going to kill a colony, but because we're talking about signs at the front of the colony, I wanted to just add a slide here. Because this is something that you're also likely to see at the same time of year, which is early spring, when you go check on your colony to see if they made and they survived the winter. This is also the time of year where you're most likely to encounter shock brood, which is why I put it at the same time. All right, so if you have shock brood, one best way to reduce the problem in the future, and for that colony and for the neighboring colony, is really you want to try to reduce transmission. So you want to clear out the dead mummies. You want to remove all comb that might have a lot of spores on them, and just try to help your bees clear out basically the infection. And because it is associated with humidity, it might be a sign that you have some ventilation issue in your colonies, and just helping them by providing a little more of an airflow will actually help them. Typically, this also tends to clear out when there is a little more of a pollen flow, and they get a little better nutrition as spring starts. All right. So once you have a look at the entrance of your colony, the next step we're going to do is actually we're going to go directly to the bottom board. So this is something you want to do before you start breaking up boxes, because the idea is that we don't want to break the cluster yet, because then the dead bees will fall to the bottom. We want to go directly to the bottom to be able to see what we can see before we break the cluster. And so here you see a couple of dead bees, you see some waxes. So what are we going to see at that bottom board? And again, we're gonna be looking for a couple of things. So we're going to be looking for, do we see a lot of dead bees, or just a little bit, or absolutely no bees? Do we see those mummies from shock brood? Do we see wax dust, mites? Do we see a dead mouse? Like whatever do we see at the bottom of the board? And typically what happens is if you see a lot of bees at the bottom of the board, so most of the time when bees die from being too cold or too wet, and usually it's a problem of humidity more than temperature, the cluster is too small to keep warm in a wet environment, and then therefore the bees on the outside of the cluster will just slowly be paralyzed by cold and fall one at a time to their deaths and just accumulate at the bottom of the colony. So depending on the number of bees that you see at the bottom, you can see, well, was the colony maybe too small to begin with? So it was too small in the fall and therefore never really reached that important cluster size to be able to keep their temperature during the winter. Or is there really a lot of bees at the bottom, which therefore might indicate more of maybe there was a dripping problem and moisture problem, and despite their big size, they were not able to keep the temperature. So those are indication of issues. If we don't see a lot of bees or not at all, this might actually be more indicative of a disease issues, because bees that are diseased, they tend to actually leave the nest, and that is all an evolved behavior to try to reduce infection in a colony. So this is a behavior that social insects have evolved in order to reduce infection in their social community. When an individual is sick, feels that is sick, they tend to leave the colony to die outside. Alternatively, they can also just be too weak to come back to the colony after a cleansing flight. And those are the cases in which you would not find dead bees inside of the colony. If you see a lot of wax dust, this might actually be a sign that the colony has been robbed. And so this would typically happen probably a little earlier in the fall, earlier in the fall or late fall, so before the winter, that the colony was too weak and basically got robbed out by another colony. And sometimes if you don't go to your colony at the end of the fall all the way to winter, you will only see it in the spring, but the wax dust, basically lines of wax dust might be a sign that this is something that happens. You can sometimes also find directly dead mites at the bottom of the frame, and that would of course indicate a very large infestation of mites that you might have missed. I mentioned dead mouse because though a mouse is very unlikely to be able to kill a colony, here is an example of a mouse that tried her best. Because obviously a colony is really, temperature controlled and full of honey, and full of protein. So it sounds like a very good idea if you're a mouse, but it actually isn't. But as you can see that the bees have completely unrobed the mouse in propolis. But sometimes even after doing that, the stench of the mouse rotting becomes too much for the bees, and that will actually sometimes encourage the bees to abscond their hive. So it is something that I've heard happen, to have a rodent that entered the hive. Of course, the rodent can damage, if a hive is weak or already dead, the mice that come in can completely damage and ruin your equipment. The mice itself is unlikely to kill your colony, but a dead mice rotting at the bottom of a colony might actually induce that colony to abscond. So those are ways in which rodents can be problematic over the winter. All right, after looking at the bottom board, we're going to actually open the hive. And one of the first things that we should look for are signs of humidity. Again, I think I said that earlier a little already, bees can handle cold very well, but they cannot handle humidity. And so we usually say cold, wet bees are dead bees because they really struggle to keep their temperature and to keep their cluster when they're humid. So the signs of humidity would be, some signs of mold on the inner cover, or in this case, this is actually a person put plexiglass on top of their hive just to observe them over the winter without having to disturb them too much. And I don't think it was a huge problem for him, but this is just a good show that, yeah, a colony, the colony will breathe, which means that it will have condensation happening. And you can see here just you can very see clearly the condensation, which is why I really like this picture, because it really shows that the humidity comes from the bees themselves. So it's not because you're insulating the colony that you're protecting it from humidity. The humidity comes from the bees themselves. Okay. All right, so the next step will be then to examining the cluster itself. And so obviously, so this is a picture of a dead out. All of those bees here are dead. They just look asleep. Some of them you can see, face down in the cells. You can just see the bottoms peeking out. And we actually have here a queen surrounded by a small cluster. And you can see a layer of mold on everything. So, those are the type of things that you want to look for is what is the size of the cluster, if any? Do you still see the queen? Do you still see brood? Can you actually find the stores, the food stores in your colony? Is it close to the cluster or a little further away? Like what is the distance? What is the position of the bees themselves, right? Are they face down? Are they face up? Like what is their position in the brood? If you have capped brood or open brood still, do you see anything weird with it? Do you see any discoloration or contorted larvae? Is there a smell to it? Those are all the things that you want to try to look for. And as I was mentioning, sometimes mold is indicative of humidity, but sometimes it's really just indicative that there has been a lot of time that went by before you actually saw and found the dead out, right? So in this case, for example, this small cluster of bees is completely moldy. It doesn't mean per se that they died because of the humidity, but it's just a sign that they've been dead for a little bit. So if you see that, you might want to try to find out other signs of humidity that can confirm or deny if humidity has been a factor in this particular dead out. And here is another important myth to debunk, that if you see a colony in this state, a lot of people will go to the conclusion that wax moths kill their colony. This is actually really not the case. Wax moths are not able on their own to kill a colony. They are what we call opportunistic pests. So they will only take over if a colony is extremely weak or already dead. So that's why you also have to protect your stored equipment from wax moths, because they will really move in any equipment that is not protected by bees. And when they do, they will create havoc to your equipment. They will really destroy your equipment, and it's going to be completely unusable. So it's a very problematic problem for beekeepers, but it's not the cause of colony death. All right, and as I said, finally, one thing that you're going to also question if you have had a dead out, or if someone asking you for your opinion because they had a dead out, is what are the information that you can find about this colony? First would be, do you have any record that the varroa was under control? And note that I'm not saying was the colony treated, but actually was the varroa under control is a different question, because as we know, and as you know from participating in Sentinel, it's not because you're treating that any treatment can be 100% effective. You can also be reinfested, unfortunately. So having some records of monitoring and knowing what the level of varroa was before the winter in the fall is really important. We also might want to know what was the size of the colony in the fall or at the last inspection. What were the level of the food stores going in the fall? And finally, did the person apply any fall or winter supplementary feeding, right? So did you do any feeding in the fall? Did you have any emergency feeding at the top of the colony during the winter? All of those things are things that are also going to help us to make a diagnostic. All right, so next slide is going to be our most wanted slide. So this is the top 3 causes of colony deaths in the winter, as reported by beekeepers, and that's typically varroa mites, starvation, and then any moisture, humidity related issue. And so we're going to go over them to really be able to identify those as they're the most prevalent issues over the winter for a colony death. So as we said, moisture is a really big enemy of the colony. Colonies can handle very, very low temperatures, but moisture is really what's going to be damaging a colony. So as the colony breathes, there you go. As the colony breathes, the colony will produce water vapor, and at the contact with the top cover and the cold outside, that water is going to just condensate and then drips back on the bees. So when that water drips back onto the bees will actually freeze, and then just cold bees are just gonna just forgot my word. They're just gonna be unable to move and just drop to the bottom of the hive and just die at the bottom. So that's when you will have an agglomeration of dead bees at the bottom board is usually a consequence of the moisture impacting the bees. So here you can see an illustration of this where you have a very, very small cluster at the end, though those are even, they died and stayed in place because they were just stuck together. But you can see at the bottom of the frames here, just the accumulation of bees that just died and fell on top of one another because of the cold, probably resulting biohumidity problem in this hive. So in order to protect your hive for those, really the issue is going to be ventilation, and even more than isolation, ventilation is going to be the key. You want to provide a good airflow in your colony to try to get rid of that water. So one way would be to actually have some type of absorbent material at the top of the cover just to absorb the humidity so that the water doesn't condense and fall back onto the hive. Another technique that I've heard of is inclining the top cover, just so that if the water condensates, it drips to the front of the colony, to the entrance, and not on top of the bees. So that's another tip that I've heard works pretty good. In any case, you want to clear the entrance of any debris to ensure there is a continuous airflow. So if you go to your colony during the winter and you notice that there is a pack of snow at the top of the entrance, you might want to clear that out. If you notice that the entrance is packed with dead bees, again, you want to clear that out just to continue providing airflow for the remaining bees that are inside. Another thing you want to consider is to provide an upper entrance. And so that's the same idea, that you help increase the airflow, but you also provide a backup exit in case the bottom entrance is blocked. All right, starvation is another very common cause of colony loss over the winter. And so this is a very characteristic one. So unfortunately, this looks super cute until you realize that all of those bees are dead. So butts out, they're all trying to basically reach in for food and warmth. Typically, sometimes you actually can see a cluster of bees like that, and you can actually have a ring of food a couple of inches away. And then beekeepers will say, well, how can my bees died from starvation? There was a couple of there was frames of food right at the outside of the cluster, or maybe right on top of the cluster, just a couple of inches away. And so this would actually be a combination of both very cold weather and starvation. So the food was just a little out of reach, and because of the very cold weather, the bees were not able to move the cluster. They were not able to move as a cluster towards the food, and so they died on their spots. So yeah, the only way to manage against that is making sure that your colonies is really well fed throughout the fall. You want to make sure that you do heavy fall feeding, definitely if you don't have honey flow anymore, to make sure that they have enough reserves. And then it's going to be really this kind of bets where you have to know that if the size of your colony is going to be big enough at the beginning of the fall to maintain that cluster size in which they can still keep their internal temperature and be able to move to wherever they need to get to the food. If the cluster gets a little too small, it's not going to be able to move anymore, even if the resources are right there. One thing to note too is that a lot of beekeepers use emergency feeding. So dry sugar is a really good emergency feed, but one thing to know is that it's very quickly metabolized. It's very more quickly metabolized than honey and syrup. Therefore, it's really good as an emergency, but it's really not a long snack. So dry sugar can go by really quickly. So if you do use it and you notice that the bees are using it, try to think about replacing it because it's not going to last them long. All right, and then finally, this is probably the #1 culprit of issues. And so basically, this is an issue all year long, but this is going to really, all of the issues associated with varroa are going to combine and make it that the colony is not going to make it to the spring. So it's kind of like, the combination of all of the stressors of due to varroa and its viruses associated with varroa throughout the years are going to result in a collapse of the colony and a dead out before the spring. So a couple of things that you can identify an issue associated with varroa. So typically the case that we hear is beekeepers that will tell us, my colony was very big and looked really healthy in the fall. And so they're very surprised that those big colonies are going to be the first one to collapse. And so one thing to realize here is that big colonies are the ones that rear a lot of mites. So if you haven't been on top of your monitoring, if you don't know what your varroa loads are, big colonies are actually the ones that are more likely to have high number of mites. So that's something to keep an eye out for. Then the second thing is when they open the dead out, they realize the colony still has a lot of honey left in the top supers. And so what that tells us is that means the colony died relatively early in the winter. That's why they didn't go to their reserves. And so really that's like a very quick drop in population due to the viruses. Sometimes we even know that sick colonies, when they are really ridden by viruses, that stress can induce a colony to abscond even in the fall. So sometimes you will have seen it at the end of the summer, the colony was really big, and then the viruses really take their tolls and the sick colonies decide to leave and abscond in the fall. And so in that case, you will still have plenty of reserve because they actually didn't go through any part of this winter in that colony. So when the beekeepers open the colony in the spring, the cluster, if there is any cluster left, might be extremely small, like a softball size of cluster, really small. And so that is really due to the fact that varroa, we know varroa peaks at the time when winter bees are formed, which is the fall. And so those colonies that emerge in the fall that are going to be your winter bees, because they're ridden with viruses that are associated with varroa, with a heavy varroa presence, they tend to be more short-lived, and that's going to make the difference between having those winter bees being able to survive all the way to the spring or not. And so therefore, that's why in spring you will have a very, very small cluster, because basically those are the only surviving bees, the other ones having perished earlier than they should have because of viruses. And then finally, another sign is that, as we were saying, despite those bees, having died, you will probably only see hardly any bees on the bottom board, or very few. And that's again because as we have seen, sick bees tend to fly away rather than die on the spot, or again they might be too sick to return from a cleansing flight, and so. That's really opposed to starvation, where bees, die of cold and fall to the bottom and accumulate at the bottom board. If you have an infection due to varroa, typically those bees tends to leave the colony, and therefore you don't actually see a lot of dead bees at the bottom of the board. Okay. And then I put this picture here. So this is when you see those bees dead on emergence, it's not always a sign of varroa, but this is one of the things that can again point to the direction that varroa is more likely. So this will be typically, if you have a patch of broods near the cluster, you will see that some of those bees are dead on emergence with their tongue sticking out. They basically were too weak to even get out of their cell. And so typically that is something that we see associated with viruses. And so again, a signs of varroa infestations that were associated with heavy heavy varroa. If you can open some of those cells and pull some of the dead brood out, you might have a confirmation by the actual presence of varroa in the cells. And then finally, I wanted to show you this picture, which again, this will be kind of like the last nail in the coffin, that this is actually due to a varroa infestation. So sometimes you can see, if you angle the frame, you will see some like crystallized, not crystallized honey, but it looks like coarse salt on the edge of frames of brood, right? So you notice it's not honey. And this is actually guanine. So guanine acid, sorry, that is the result of the defecation of varroa. So in very, very high infestation of varroa, you will actually be able to see those type of crystals, coarse salt at the edge. You know, here you can see with the frame angled at the edge of those cells, and those are the signs of a very bad infestation. All right, so we went through all of the very likely causes, and once you've eliminated them, then you can go into the other potential causes. Obviously, some of them are more obvious than others. So in this case, I just thought it was interesting to show those couple of pictures that have been shared with us by a couple of beekeepers. So when the equipment is completely destroyed like that the frames are destroyed, it's very, in this case, it was evident to the beekeeper that this was a bear attack. So unfortunate, but thankfully quite rare. Another thing that you can look at, and this is actually probably going to be throughout the year, but if you have a dead out in which you see a bunch of those queen cells that have been open, those are what we call emergency cells. And so that's very different from the actual queen cells that the bee do in time of swarming, when they're planning to swarm and they're planning to raise a new queen. So the way you can tell that those are emergency cell is that when there is really a high number of them, they've been drawn directly from the frame instead of from the cell. So basically you can they were in a way in a hurry to produce them. And so this is just an indication that probably there was some incident with the queen died and they had to replace her in a hurry. So if you find a dead out and you find some of the signs of very recent queen cells in the colony, then you might know that this was a failing queen that the colony tried to replace and maybe failed to do so. So that would just be another indication of an issue. And then finally, again, very, very rare, but I could not show you a picture, definitely in the time of Halloween, because this is probably a very, very scary picture. AFB is American fall brood. So this is probably another cause of fully dead out, because colonies that are infected by AFB have a very high chance of completely collapsing because it's a very, very dangerous disease for them. So typical, the high infection of AFB will result in colonies that look like this, where very greasy, sunken, and perforated caps of brood. It's typically, I've heard, very smelly. And then there is, a couple of tests, the rope test that you can do to try to identify that it's actually AFB. But there is also a molecular test, right? Kind of a little bit like the COVID at home test that you can do. You can do a very similar type of test to confirm AFB. And obviously, if you have AFB, this is one of the mandatory reportable disease. So you want to contact your apiary inspectors that are going to guide you through how to deal with any other colony that you might have in the yard and how to get rid of the equipment of the infected colony. All right. And then finally, I wanted to finish by showing you a short video. This is a case of a colony that actually in the end survived. But the beekeeper was really afraid that he was going to have a complete dead out because there was a lot. They can see here on this first frame of the video, a lot of dead bees in front of the colony, and this is just because. Let me just start the video. Again, nope. Laser pointer out. There we go. So a lot of times people will say, oh, if you have like bees that are shaking and trembling in front of the colony, it is a sign of a pesticide kill. In this case, actually, we did sample the colony and we looked for pesticides and we looked for viruses. And this is actually the result of a chronic bee paralysis virus. Again, it's pretty rare, but this is just to say that even though, it seems very clearly, some people will say this is clearly a pesticide kill. It actually wasn't. And that's why it's so difficult to identify some of those pesticide kills that can look a lot like viral infections, actually. Well, actually, viral infection can look a lot like pesticide kills. So in this case, the colony actually survived. So it was really smaller for a couple of months, and then the colony managed to pick up and regrow for the rest of the season, and that colony made it in the end. So very, very impressive, but in the end, they actually made it. All right, so we're going to finish by what I promised earlier. Can I reuse the equipment depending on how my colony died? And so there is a couple of rules there. The first, of course, is if you suspect a case of American fall brood, you should never reuse the equipment. This is also the principal reason why we really recommend to people to never buy used equipment, because you never know what could be the history of those colonies. And American fall brood is a very, very resistant disease in that they produce spores that are very resistant. They can last for decades on equipment. So yeah, if you suspect anything there, again, contact your apiary inspectors, but that colony should not be reused. If you suspect any other contagious disease like European fall brood, nosema, chalk brood, there are ways that you can actually just reduce the chance of having further contagions. You can use thermal decontamination. Some people want to, basically heat their colonies. Freezing also works, so we recommend freezing for a couple of days, and that's probably the most practical way that you can try to deal with equipment that is a little bit questionable. There are other methods, but freezing is probably the most easy to use. And then obviously, finally, if the likely cause of death was something that is really, starvation, condensation, a queen event, a bear attack, any of those things, you're obviously free to use any of that equipment. And with a note that if the equipment is really moldy, and that might just be due because of condensation issues or because you haven't noticed the dead out for a long time, just note that it might not be worth it to reuse it. Yes, your bees might be able to clear it out, but you're really giving them extra work by giving them moldy equipment. Just consider the cost benefits of reusing moldy equipment. And with that, I finish by a picture of something that really does not frighten us, even though it might frighten a lot of other people. So this is a scary, not scary picture of very happy, healthy bees, because I wanted to finish on a positive note. And with that, I'll take any questions.